I'm back today to share the next Wooble that I made, this time with a bit of a holiday theme. It's Ralph the Reindeer. I'm May, and this is May's Crochets. I'm a beginner crocheter sharing my learning to crochet journey. A lot of what I've been doing to learn how to crochet has been working my way through a bunch of the Woobles Learn to Crochet kits. I have videos on my channel of all of the previous Woobles that I've made. I will link my playlist here if you want to take a look at any of those. But today I'm excited to share this Ralph the Reindeer pattern. So let's take a look at the kit. Here he is, Ralph the Reindeer. We've got our holiday vibes, Mr. Rudolph, I guess, with the red nose, although his name is Ralph. Here is how he's supposed to come out. This is the back of the kit. So just like all of the other Woobles, it has everything you need to finish this project. We've got yarn, videos, pre-started piece, crochet hook, stuffing, safety eyes, tapestry needle, and online instructions. So without further ado, let's take a look at my Ralph. Here he is. Hi. Okay, let me show you. So let's take a look at the front. I will spin him around. Do. Okay, let's take a look at the top. And you can sort of see from behind the top. Boom, boom, boom. His antlers. And then the bottom. Okay, so let's talk through this pattern. Ralph the Reindeer. So the Wooble body is similar to many of the other Wooble bodies where it's really just an egg shape. So a lot of the other Woobles that I've made previously also have the very standard egg shape. You start at the top with the magic ring. They give you a pre-started piece that has the magic ring already done for you, although I do it myself because I use a slightly smaller crochet hook. I used a 3.5 millimeter hook for this one. So I do the magic ring myself. Work my way down. There's, it's increasing, lots of single crochet. Towards the bottom, there's decreasing. You place the safety eyes, you stuff, and you close it up on the bottom. I will say for this one, the stuffing, I probably didn't stuff him enough. You can see he's very mushy versus some of my other ones are much more like rigid with a lot more stuffing. I have previous videos where I've talked about yarn over versus yarn under, and I actually used yarn over this time, which I a little bit regret maybe. So yarn under ends up showing the holes between the stitches a little bit less. It does seem that this type of yarn, this easy peasy, it's like t-shirt yarn, stretches a lot and is just much more prone to holes between the stitches than some other yarns. I mean, you can really see it. But for some reason with this one, I just decided to go with yarn over, and I did use a 3.5 millimeter hook, which is slightly smaller than the 4.0 millimeter hook that they have in their kit and that they recommend with this yarn. But in the end, there's really definitely holes. So I'll link to my other videos where I talk about yarn over versus yarn under. Yarn under with the Woobles yarn still often leaves some amount of holes, even with a smaller hook. But this one with the yarn over, it's so apparent. So because of that, I saw right off the bat, look at all these holes. I don't want to overstuff him because if I overstuff him, the holes will just get worse and worse and worse. But honestly, despite, not overstuffing him and keeping him very overall, I'd say pretty lightly stuffed, you can definitely still see the holes. In the end, I guess it doesn't super matter how much you do the stuffing in terms of like the look of it. The feel of it is much more like mushy, or I don't know if that's squishy, I guess. I can really like make him very thin, or I can like squish him down this way. Honestly, the picture, he looks a lot more like square versus I feel like when I was first showing him, I had him a lot more like kind of taller. So I don't know. I guess I can sort of massage him into whatever shape I want with the stuffing, but I probably didn't quite stuff him enough. I still haven't really not figured this out, like what is the right amount of stuffing. But I was trying not to, make the holes that much worse. And, in the end, I think he does look fine other than the holes. But the stuffing amount maybe doesn't matter all that much, but it does kind of change the way it feels in the end. So that was the Wooble body. Next up, this is interesting. I was following mostly the written pattern. When you get a Woobles kit, they link to videos, step-by-step instructions, super, super bite-sized and detailed to teach you how to crochet. And they also have a written pattern. And so as I've been, getting better at crocheting, a lot of times I will follow the written pattern for kind of a lot of the standard parts, and then I'll switch over to the videos for anything a little more non-standard, or just to like remind myself of how to do something, double check that I know how to do something. So for this one, I was following the written pattern for sure for the body, since I've done the body like this a zillion times. And then next up on the written pattern was the ears. So I did that next, although interestingly on the video, they have you do the snout next and the ears come later. So I guess it doesn't really matter what order you do. These are like totally separate, but I'm gonna just talk it through in the order that I made them. So I did the ears next. So the ears are just, it's really small. It's just like, it's a magic ring and then one round. And I think that's it. And you sew them on just along the bottom. So a lot of other pieces, when you're sewing them down, like the antlers, you're sewing like all the way around the edge, and kind of slowing the entire piece down to the body, versus in this case, you're keeping the inside of the ears exposed to get that little look, and you're just sewing through kind of the bottom stitch to attach it. So it was a little bit funny. I struggled a little bit with like the placement of this and getting the ears to look exactly right, but I think I got it in the end. I went through more than maybe just the bottom stitch to kind of get it secure. But that's how that came out. And I did usually the extra thread or the trailing yarn from the magic ring. You can kind of just like leave inside and it disappears. But in this case, you can see the inside. And so I ended up cutting it. And I hope that that's okay. I hope that that's not like gonna get undone. But I think with the magic ring, it's like pretty secure. But I wasn't sure about that. I could actually have threaded it like, more through the body, through the ear, to secure it a little bit better in that way. I will say, once I finished this, so I just had the egg-shaped body and the two ears, and I looked at it and I really thought it looked like a mouse, a little tan mouse, but then I kept going. So next up, I did the snout and the nose. Okay, so the snout is this interesting technique that I've done a couple of other times before, where you make an oval with basically a chain, and then you crochet around the chain, and then you do some single crocheting and it turns into an oval. I have to say, honestly, in this case, for me at least, it did not come out super oval. It came out much more circular, and it's a lot easier to just do a circle magic ring standard, kind of like the ears and the antlers. But I followed the technique to do the oval, and I feel like in the end I stitched it on pretty circularly, but maybe it was supposed to be a little bit more of an oval. Let's take a picture. Look at the picture. Yeah, it's a little more of an oval there, you can see. So maybe that's just my stitching, but when I follow this technique, I have another video where I talk about this kind of chain and single crochet around in more detail, where I was very confused about exactly which stitches to go into, and I actually reached out to Wooble support, which confirmed it to me. So I'll link to that video here. But this time it was another chance to try it, which was fun because now this is like a kind of an interesting challenge for me, since I've only done this a few times and often struggled with it. I did end up with quite a large hole, I would say, on one side of the nose. I think from when you have the chain and then you're crocheting into the chain, if you're like pulling a little bit, you can end up with a hole. And so I'm actually grateful for the embroidery of the nose, which comes after the sewing on of the snout. You just take red yarn and kind of go back and forth a few times to embroider this nose, and that actually really nicely covered up this hole, so you can maybe see it a little bit, but yeah, it really filled in this empty hole. So if there hadn't been nose embroidery, it would have been a lot more apparent with the hole, but the nose embroidery really helps. And so in the end, when I very first sewed on the snout, this always happens to me, I sewed on the snout one round too low, like entirely too low. And I like finished it and I thought it looked fine, but I like didn't really count, I guess, even though it very clearly says like rounds 8 to 10. And I very clearly did 9 to 11. I looked at the end and I ended up cutting it out and redoing it because I wanted it to be exactly right. It probably would have been fine to have been a little bit lower, although actually we do have the embroidery down here, so I'm glad that it ended up a little bit higher to make better room for this embroidery. I need to be a little more careful when I'm placing things and sewing them on and like just double check the counting. So that was the snout. Now, when I finished, at this point I had just the body, the ears, and the snout, the nose. And at that point, it really looked like a pig. It was like a tan pig before I embroidered on the nose. I should have taken pictures so I could have shown you kind of the interim progress and my impressions of all these different animals. Once I added the red nose with the embroidery, I actually thought it looked a little bit like a chipmunk. with a red nose. It had like the ears, the nose, and then the little colored in nose, although red. So, and I guess red for Rudolph. But it looked a little like a chipmunk. So then I finally did the antlers. And so the antlers are, it's four separate pieces that are all just like rounds of six, magic ring, and then rounds of six, two long ones. So that's like 8 rounds of six, and then two really short ones, which are only 2 rounds. And then you, embroider, or you sew, sorry, the small end onto the big end on both sides. So this little small piece gets attached to the side of the larger one, and then you sew on the entire antler right inside of the ears. So I think I did okay there. You know, usually I really obsess about placement, but I think I landed in an okay spot here. I did not have to redo these for once. I kind of just went with it, and I feel like it came out pretty fine on these antlers. And then last up was this little embroidery that I guess they were saying the chest, the chest embroidery. I'm glad that we added this. I actually think it adds a really nice touch. And before this was there, it looked, okay, finally was looking like a reindeer, right? We got antlers now, and no longer is it a pig or a chipmunk or a mouse. But the bottom was just this big sort of tan, like egg-shaped bottom. And so I feel like the embroidery adds a really nice touch. It almost reminds me of like a sweater, like is the reindeer wearing a sweater with like a nice little pattern that repeats. And I actually think they look a little bit like hearts, which is really sweet. They're just V's. But I actually really like this. So this is just embroidery. It tells you kind of where to put your needle through and then how to kind of make those V's. It's funny, actually, in the video, hers don't look exactly like this. Her V's end up with a full space between like the top and the top left and right of the V has a full stitch between them. So the V's are a lot wider than this, and it ends up super off center because of that, but I guess it doesn't really super matter. And it still looks fine. It still looks good. And it still also has that look of like a sweater. But in this case, I like this a little bit better because it's more centered. And so we're pretty centered under the snout, maybe not 100% perfect. But I did do kind of what they said of where to put the first one, and I just went with it. So, and I like that there's sort of the top line of 3 and the bottom line of 2, and they're centered that way. And again, I'm glad that the snout, I had moved it back up 1 because if they were even lower down, it would have been harder to see. And again, we can compare it to the picture, which has it nicely centered. And yeah, I feel like it adds that really nice touch. I actually love doing these sort of embroidery finishing pieces to these plushies because it's easier, I guess, than doing a whole other like sew or crochet a whole other body part and then have to sew it on. The embroidery is like much quicker to do. And it adds a lot of character. A link to my last Wooble that I made was Frankenstein, Steve the Frankenstein for Halloween, and he had a ton of really cool like embroidery details that gave him so much character, but without being too complicated because it's just embroidery, do, as opposed to having to do a whole crochet and sew on a piece and all of that. So I actually finished Ralph the Reindeer in 1 day, which is rare for me. A lot of these they're very doable in 1 day, but like I do have a 3-year-old and a job and I'm very busy. And so actually having time to kind of sit down and do crocheting, a lot of times I'm kind of doing a little bit, putting it down, doing a little bit more, putting it down, which I did do over the course of a day, but I did actually finish it in a day, which was nice. This one is considered beginner, and I think a lot of them are considered beginner plus, but this one is true beginner. And I think that this would be a good one for a beginner. It does have some amount of complexity, so it's not as beginner friendly as, say, Kiki the Chick or Pierre the Penguin, but it's still relatively on the beginner side. The challenges for sure are the snout and doing that chain and then crocheting into the chain method. I think that piece is definitely a challenge. And then really just, I guess, the sewing on of the pieces, like making these antler pieces and the ears. It's pretty standard, and it's a really good practice of doing a magic ring, or you can also do the chain 2 method to start off. They show you basically you have both options to do in the video, so that's totally fine. But I think getting the pieces sewn down correctly is always an interesting challenge. And so that is a little bit tricky for a beginner, but really good practice. And then the embroidery is kind of fun. So probably the snout is maybe the hardest part, but there's not like so much complexity here that I wouldn't recommend this for a beginner. I could totally see a beginner doing this one. Maybe not for your very first kit, but maybe like for your second. But if you're up for the challenge, I could totally see someone doing this. This is a fun one, especially if you're into like Christmas and holidays and stuff like that. And you got this adorable red nose and he comes out really cute. I will say this is a little bit similar to one of the other previous Woobles that I made. It was Roosevelt the Moose. I actually have him here. Here we go. That's Roosevelt the Moose. Similar, like, egg-shaped body, open ears, antlers, although in this case the antlers are turned in a different direction, and Roosevelt's, the moose's antlers, the sort of small part of them are a little bit bigger, and his snout is a whole lot bigger, and he has these goofy nostrils. I will link my video for Roosevelt the Moose here. I had some struggles making him with the snout, getting it centered the right size, doing that chain and, crochet around method. I think that this one, Ralph the Reindeer, was a lot smoother, maybe partially because I'd already done this one. At first, when I was doing Ralph the Reindeer, I actually wasn't even that excited to do him because it felt pretty similar to the moose. But in the end, there's enough differences. I love the red nose. I love the embroidery of the chest. Fur, I guess. And I think he came out really, really cute. Of these two, I think I prefer Ralph the Reindeer in the end, although I do like them both. And they both are a little bit like holiday, wintry something. So that is Ralph the Reindeer. I have one more kind of wintry Wooble that I will be making in the future. So stay tuned for that video. But I think that's it for today. Thank you so much for keeping me company, and I'll see you next time. Bye.